today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to continue the study we began last week. Jacob's Dozen is the name of the book by William Varner. And we've covered the first four sons of Jacob as on his deathbed in Genesis 49, he begins to tell what will befall each of the sons in the last days. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the sons of Jacob.
And we continue on from Judah, the Messianic tribe, and today we look beginning with Zebulun and Issachar. And J.R., what's fascinating to me about these 12 sons is that they really make up a total picture, each one being roughly a 12th of the total picture of redeemed mankind. Each one seems to have a role assigned to him. Zebulun, for example, has something to do with the sea. Now, we haven't really had much of a statement up to now about the sea and seafaring people, but with Zebulun, we come to a prophecy about the sea.
According to verse 13 of Genesis 49, Zebulun shall dwell at the haven of the sea. He shall be for a haven of ships, and his border shall be unto Zidon. You know, Gary, this is interesting to me about Zebulun because Asher was given the territory along the coastline there from south of Mount Carmel up through to Lebanon's border, and Asher never completely populated all of his territory, and eventually Zebulun then drifted down to the seashore and was in control of the harbor at what we call today Haifa.
And there was a lot of drifting among the sons. Many of the sons did not take, as we'll see as we continue this study, they didn't take their allotted territory. They saw other ground that they liked better. Some of the tribes did not claim. For example, some of the tribes didn't chase out the Canaanites as they were supposed to, but rather coexisted with them, which was against God's will, by the way. But Zebulun...
The name Zebulun means dwelling.
Yes.
And so he dwelt. In other words, he just sort of squatted, like a squatter, you know. I mean, he went down to Asher's territory, and he dwelt there, and he dwelt in his territory. He spread out, and he went into shipping, and he was quite a business tycoon, evidently.
Yeah, we could call him a trader or a merchant. Perhaps he's the father of merchant maritime trader, the people of the sea. And of course, you know, as you go up the coast of Lebanon and come into ancient Phoenicia, or as it's called in the Bible, Tyre, this is the very heart of the merchant trader.
The fact that his border here will go up to Zidon,
yeah,
I think means that he learned something from the Phoenician traders in the shipping business.
Indeed he did, and there seems to be evidence that he spread far and wide.
And in Deuteronomy 33, we have Moses' blessing of him. Moses said, "For they, Zebulun, shall suck the abundance of the seas and treasures hidden in the sand." So in addition to this, what some in this generation have considered to be treasures in the sand being oil, we do have, I think, the shipping empire mentioned here. The treasures of the sand and the abundance of the seas. So he became quite wealthy. There was Egypt to the south, there was Damascus to the northeast, and all in between. And then, of course, that area was a land bridge from Europe to Africa, and no wonder it was a perfect opportunity for them to get into the shipping business.
They got into the shipping business, they became traders, and they sort of drifted off the pages of history in a way. Although Dr. Varner makes the point that we do find Zebulun being praised in Judges chapter 5, the song of Deborah and Barak later on, which says in Judges 5:18, Zebulun and Naphtali were a people that jeoparded their lives unto the death in the high places of the field. This, of course, during the days of the invasion by Sisera. And so Zebulun here is recorded in Judges 5 as being a heroic people.
And also in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, we have a similar statement of Zebulun, such as went forth to battle, expert in war, with all instruments of war, 50,000 who could keep rank. They were not of double heart. So they were a people who could think on their feet. They were very ambitious, and they went to the sea, and in the shipping, it's possible they had some kind of navy as well, you know. Here's the Navy. May not be the Air Force, but here's Israel's Navy as such. They were good warriors.
Zebulun, one of the sons of Jacob by Leah.
Now we look at Issachar. Issachar, he says, is a strong ass couching down between two burdens, and he saw that rest was good, and the land that it was pleasant, and bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant unto tribute. Gary, this idea here has, by some, seem to think that this is a degrading statement. It is not. It is a blessing, because these people became industrious. They were willing to shoulder the load, to bear the burden of the workload.
You know, in the Hebrew, he's literally called a strong-boned donkey. Well, back in those days, a strong-boned donkey would have fetched a great price, because this was the beast that did the work, carried the loads, and so forth. And so we find Issachar being likened unto something very valuable, something that is worth its salt, shall we say.
Adam Clark, in his commentary on this man, said, "It appears that they were a laborious, hardy, valiant tribe, patient in labor, invincible in war, bearing both these burdens with great constancy whenever it was necessary." Issachar, fascinating prophecy about him.
Issachar, he got the Jezreel Valley, by the way, and that's kind of fascinating in itself geographically, because if you go to the east end of the great Jezreel Valley, which some say will be the scene of the great final battle of Armageddon, you find two mountains, and so that his territory was surrounded by two mountains, and some commentators have said that these two burdens of Issachar were two mountains, really.
Two boundaries.
Two boundaries.
Tabor to the north, Gilboa to the south, and he lived in that area. Well, then the dying Jacob comes to Dan, and boy, he has a lot to say about Dan. Just a few verses here. He says, "Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward." Gary, to me, this is a prophecy of the Antichrist.
It very much is a prophecy of the Antichrist, and if there ever was a faithless group of people, it would be the Danites. The Danites were given territory down in the realm of what's called the Shephelah, the middle lands between Jerusalem and the Mediterranean Sea. And there they, I guess they coexisted with the Philistines for a while.
And the Philistines actually were, they were unable to dislodge them. Right. Nobody came to their aid. You know, look, Dan was 150,000 people plus. I mean, they were the largest tribe in all of Israel. And they helped everybody else get their territory. When he came to Dan, nobody had helped them drive out the Philistines.
And so the Danites said, well, this is not the way we want to live. By the way, it was beautiful land, beautiful territory. There's nothing wrong with the land, but Dan said, let's send out scouts, let's look for better land. And lo and behold, they found what they thought was better real estate way up north, around Laish. And so, J.R., Dan's first official act, we might say, is abandoning God's promise.
You notice they lived on the north side of the tabernacle in the camp of Israel. You know, when all the tribes pitched their tents around, Dan was on the north. Well, Dan ends up in the northernmost province of Israel, right at the foot of Mount Hermon and the headwaters of the Jordan River. In fact, the name Jordan means the going down of the Dan.
Yeah.
And then this symbol that he says, Dan is a serpent, by the way, an adder in the path that bites the horse's heel. When the tabernacle was first set up, and after Moses had it constructed, each tribe was to raise their flag as they encamped around the tabernacle, which was in the center of the camp. Well, Ahiezer, the head of the tribe of Dan, it is said, did not want to put a snake on his flag, so he changed the emblem of Dan to an eagle. So here we have the two symbols that became the infamous phoenix of history.
That's right.
The dragon-like eagle We have the eagle, who is the phoenix in the west, and in the Far East, China, Korea, Japan, and so on, the phoenix is a flying dragon.
A flying dragon.
The serpent.
And he's a serpent, by the way. Dan shall judge his people. It says in the Hebrew, Dan Yadin. Dan shall judge. And you know, in the latter days, if the Antichrist comes out of the tribe of Dan, that will be the method of God's judgment.
Yes, he will bring God's judgment upon the people of Israel. That basically is what Dan is supposed to do. He shall judge his people. Well, we'll be back with more in just a moment. A couple more things we want to say about Dan, because Dan is a symbol of the Antichrist. You recall in Revelation chapter 7, when the 144,000 are recounted, the tribe of Dan is missing. Dan is also missing from the first 10 chapters of First Chronicles, which chronicles the various tribes and brings us up to date, the year about 1050 BC. Dan is already missing. It's interesting, Gary, that Dan in Judges gives us an idea of why he disappeared.
Well, first of all, he made his home in northern Israel. They came to Laish. They killed all the people there, set up their own city. And in Judges 18:30, it says, and the children of Dan set up the graven image. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Manasseh, and he and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up their own cult worship center with graven images up there in the city of Dan, north of the Sea of Galilee up there.
Yes.
And then we find in the Song of Deborah and Barak, where Zebulun and Naphtali are praised for helping in the battle against Sisera, we find in verse 17, Gilead abode beyond Jordan. And why did Dan remain in ships? Dan is not praised at all. Dan didn't come to anybody's aid.
That's right. But the ships there that Dan had may have been the vehicle by which they left home. You see, because the tribe of Dan is the lost tribe. They disappeared.
And they left home, and there's some evidence that they may have taken up residence in what we call Greece today.
Yeah.
But that's another story.
Or Peloponnesus, the southern islands below Greece, and became, well, you know, the Spartans in Homer's Iliad are called Danaans.
That's right.
In the Iliad and Odyssey written by Homer, they make reference to the Spartans, but they don't call them Spartans, they call them Danaans, which, you know, according to history, Danaus, with his 50 daughters called the Danaids, became the king of the Spartans, who they called Danaans, and so on. So it's very, you know, it's interesting that the New Testament is written in Greek, so we may have a reference there to the tribe of Dan. And eventually, just as Alexander the Great came against Israel, or you know, conquered the world, and out of him came Antiochus Epiphanes, a Greek, who headed up Syria, part of the Greek Empire. I'll tell you, the Antichrist could very well be a Danite.
Could very well indeed. In fact, at least part Danite, and the Danites, of course, made their way in Europe. We could devote a whole program to that. We need to move on.
Let's move on to Gad. Gad, a troop shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at the last. Gad, of course, means a troop. In the Hebrew, these, out of the 6 words used here in Hebrew, I think 4 of them refer to Gad. They are play on words of the word Gad.
Where we read, Gad, a troop shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at the last, is a play, an amazing Hebrew word play on the word Gad, which we don't really have time to get into, but Gad is a warrior.
And he lived east of Jordan in the territory of what is called Gilead. So when you see Gilead, just think of Gad. Jephthah, for example, was a Gileadite, and he was the one who was victorious in war.
That's right.
And as such became a type of the future battle of Armageddon and the Messiah. And so he possibly was a Gadite. Then there was Elijah, who came from Gilead. He possibly was a Gadite as well.
Very possibly. Moving along now to the next tribe, we have in Genesis 49:20, out of Asher his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. Interesting prophecy there.
Yes, he lived around the foot of Mount Carmel, and of course the territory allotted to him looks like a leg and a foot, you know.
That's right.
And it's interesting that Moses talked about him dipping his foot in oil, and so people of recent years have been drilling for oil down along the coastline just south of Mount Carmel. That appears to be a natural formation for oil, and they found oil wherever they lost their bid. They're going back though. I was talking with a gentleman the other day in Denver who is a part of the association with the drilling of oil, and they plan to begin drilling again in the next few weeks, a couple of months maybe. So we're going. It's interesting to see what they're going to do. Maybe that time they can get down to the oil and not lose the bit and plug up the hole.
Dr. Varner speaks of another thing about the word for oil here. The word fat in verse 20 is the Hebrew shemein, which means oil. And he says traditionally this is the word that stands for olive oil. And it's not a little bit coincidental that this happens to be the greatest olive oil producing territory in all of Israel to this very day.
Interesting.
That's where the olive trees are.
Now, you know, those royal dainties are interesting too, because I've taken tour groups to Haifa, to the diamond factory, you know, and see all the diamonds and how they polish the diamonds and what have you. So it is a great export area. In fact, I bought my wife a new wedding band some years ago because her original wedding band was just one of those little cheapies when I was just a kid and couldn't afford anything, you know. So we finally bought her a little nice. I bought her a little nicer wedding band. It came from Israel.
Yeah, and Netanya which is on the south of Asher, which means gift, by the way. And is famous for diamond cutting and jewelry.
Yeah, royal dainties. How about that?
How about that?
Naphtali is a hind let loose. He giveth goodly words. Naphtali. That was the territory where Jesus took the 12 disciples and commissioned them, and the 70 and commissioned them to go out. So it was like a goodly word. The gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ went out from Naphtali's territory, and that was goodly words. And a hind let loose. In other words, those men were commissioned by Jesus to travel and to take the gospel to the other tribes.
And don't forget, Naphtali is mentioned with Zebulun as the people who risked their own lives to the death to save Israel from Sisera. That's in Judges 5:18. And a very commendable tribe.
Yeah. Now we come to the last two, and they are the children of the beloved Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. And I just imagine the dying Jacob could hardly wait till he gets to these two boys, because he had some great words to say about Joseph. He gives 5 verses here, the longest prophecy of any of them.
And why don't you go ahead and read those verses? This is a very long prophecy, but very meaningful.
Okay, Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. This is a reference, I think, to his being rejected by his brothers and sold into Egyptian bondage. But his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. And what a prophecy here. This says that Joseph is a type of the Messiah.
It certainly does.
And the rabbis have said that Joseph will produce the Messiah, that there will be 2 Messiahs, Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David. Messiah ben Joseph will die for the sins of the people. Messiah ben David will come at Armageddon and save the people and set up the kingdom. So here is a fantastic prophecy here. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. And of course you may recall that the stepfather of Jesus, the man who married Mary, was named Joseph. even by the God of thy father who shall help thee, and by the Almighty who shall bless thee with blessings of heaven above, and blessings of the deep that lieth under, the blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of thy father hath prevailed above the blessings of my progenitors, unto the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph, on the crown of the head of him that was separate from his brethren. In other words, here he just devotes the prophecy to Joseph, but the prophecy is fulfilled in Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh.
That's right. And who went on, Ephraim, of course, means fruitful. And Ephraim went on to be the fruitful tribe, the northern tribe. I think it's fascinating that the blessings of the deep are mentioned here in verse 25. In the Hebrew, that is tachat, which means the super deep. Deep, deep underground. And again, we find a reference that some have said might refer to oil in the latter days. But one thing we must remember, and that is that Joseph is generally regarded as a type of Christ, the beloved son of his father, rejected by his brethren, sold into Egypt, withstood temptation to sin. He rose to power. And by the way, he took a Gentile bride in the end, J.R.
Mm-hmm. Yes. A type of the Lord Jesus Christ. Wow. Now let's talk about Benjamin. You know, this is the last one.
Mm-hmm.
And according to Matthew Henry, commentary, he says, it is plain that Jacob spoke by prophecy and not by natural affection, else he would have spoken with more tenderness of his beloved Benjamin, because he said, Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Well, the history of Benjamin is a checkered one, of course, but in the end, we have some tremendous blessings given from the tribe of Benjamin. Let's talk about the two Sauls here. King Saul, before David became king, was a Benjamite, and he was a ravenous wolf, wasn't he?
Yeah, King Saul was a ravenous wolf, if ever there was one. He promised leadership, and he ended up wanting to take it all for himself, and the Lord rejected him. And then in the New Testament, Saul of Tarsus was a ravening wolf against the church. He was a young Jewish zealot who actually wanted to tear the church apart.
Yeah, but the Lord stopped him one day on the road to Damascus and made him one of the great blessings of history. 14 books of the New Testament, 13, probably 14, were written by him, and he indeed fulfilled. At night he shall divide the spoil. In other words, Benjamin became, the last one here, became the great blessing. Judah provided the Messiah, Joseph a type of the Messiah, and Benjamin preached the Messiah.
Benjamin redeemed by Christ through Saul, who became the Apostle Paul. It's a great story.
Well, it's been a blessing going through these, and I'll tell you, this book by William Varner Jacobs is a blessing to me. We'll be back in just a moment.